So tonight we're going to talk about chivalry and how it relates, where it came from, and how it has evolved through the ages. And I'd like to first explain this picture. So this is a screenshot from one of the most recent Transformers movies, The Last Knight, which for those of you who know me and for those of you who will get to know me better, I am a huge fan of Transformers. So it is natural that I choose this particular image, as in this film they do talk about the Knights of the Round Table of Arthurian legend, which we will talk about later, and how it relates to the film's plot. And I thought, what a neat way to insert this into the context of tonight's talk. So without further ado, let's begin. All right. So, what exactly is chivalry? Before we can have a proper discussion, we need to know what it exactly means, how it originated, and how it's changed. So, the definition of chivalry, as per Webster, is it is the system of values such as loyalty and honor that knights in the Middle Ages were expected to follow. And when we talk about the Middle Ages, typically, if people had to date that, it would be anywhere from the 6th century to the 15th century. So it is a subject of debate, but typically it's accepted that with the fall of Roman civilization until, let's say, the fall of Constantinople, that's when the Middle Ages or Dark Ages or medieval era was thought to have taken place. And it's during this time that you had Germanic tribes start to form kingdoms, introduction of Christianity, and the Renaissance, and other such events that were important in European history. And when we talk about chivalry as a concept, it actually emerged around the 10th century AD in France. So this was from the Carolingian Empire per the Charlemagne. So some of you may have heard the name. It is the he was the father of Europe, called such because he was the first figure to unite most of Western and Central Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, and he actually was the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And so his empire actually fought against Spain and as well as the Muslims around the 8th century. And it was here that what we know as knights, so mounted soldiers on horseback, were used in combat. And from their word, they have, and I'm going to butcher this, hopefully not, but they had a term for these warriors on horseback or horse soldiery known as chivalry. So a derivative, or how that is where chivalry was derived. Now, as far as breaking it down, cheval is actually French for horse. And for those familiar with Demolay, I believe there is a award or citation known as the Chevalier Award given to exceptional Demolay. Now, it's easy to see that not everyone could exactly be a horseback soldier. It would take discipline, it would take training for them to be able to participate as such. So immediately you see distinction from the common masses to those who became knights. And additionally, the term knight, its origins aren't exactly known. It has been speculated to have come from Knecht in German, and that refers to in their language, that refers to a servant or a bondman. So this sort of equals to the character of a servant soldier fighting on horseback, and this is a central concept of chivalry. Now, that was the accepted definition of chivalry at the time. Throughout the ages, it has since become a concept more so of a code of conduct or etiquette, particularly when referring to a gentleman and how he should carry himself in the social sphere. And that's how its usage is today. And we often hear the phrase, chivalry is dead, or things akin to that. So I want to take a moment to pause, and especially if you're viewing this later in video, just a more moment to think about your own definition of chivalry and how you see it implemented in today's world. Just take a moment to pause. Now, whenever we discuss about chivalry, and especially since this talk is focusing on Templar and being sponsored by Templary, we're going to talk about the chivalric orders of masonry. Now, nothing is going to be communicated that violates any vows or obligations, just as the front end. But we talk about the chivalric orders, and they're referred to as them because they are not necessarily degrees. So throughout the Blue Lodge degrees and in the York Rite up to the chivalric orders, we follow the story or the customs of a stonemason, of craftsmen, of the legend of ancient craft masonry. That is changes when we go into the chivalric orders. So we essentially depart from the system of degrees and go into orders because, again, at this point, we're not wearing aprons, we're not focusing on the operative and speculative masonry of old, we're focusing more so towards the values and the traditions that the medieval Knights Templar and the tenets of chivalry inculcated. So, in the illustrious Order of the Red Cross, we are introduced to a character who, again, sort of, it's our last departure from the lore of King Solomon's Temple, and which is exemplified in another degree in the York Rite. And then we go on to the Order of Malta. This is the departure from Masonry as we know it, and is more based on the Old Testament and sort of leans into the first Christian order, really. And then finally, with the Order of the Temple, we are told about essentially the story of the story and sacrifice of Jesus Christ and how that is inculcated and relates to our journey then on trying to become a member of the Order of the Temple or Knights Templar. And you often hear from those who have experienced Order of the Temple that when conferred properly, it is one of the most beautiful ceremonies in all of Masonry, which is true. So when taking into account all three of these orders, it's important to recognize that while the Master Mason degree is always referred to as the highest degree you can receive, just because these are orders doesn't mean they're any different. We have to continually think about how they are lateral branches of growth. They build on what we already learned from ancient craft masonry or Blue Lodge masonry. And as Knights Templar, particularly for those who are already members or Sir Knights, it's important to know that we are not literal successors of the Knights Templars of the previous centuries. More so, we are their spiritual successors, and we carry their tenets and their values. But it's also important that we uphold those values and focus on those rather than things like our inspections or local inspections or our accoutrements and regalia. So there's a lot to be taken for those who are not yet York Rite Masons are interested, and for those who are even members currently, there's a lot of education information to be unfolded just in these three orders alone. Now, chivalry, as we know it, in the medieval era, came about most roughly in the 12th century, although there were explanations of it or prior to it. So we know, like I said earlier, there was the Arthurian legend, and I may be speaking just for myself, but personally, that was my first introduction into the concept of knights and chivalry with the Knights of the Round Table. So the tale of King Arthur, of his famous knights, Gawain, Lancelot, and of Merlin, of Guinevere, and Excalibur, that these were wondrous tales of chivalry. Not necessarily truth, because to this day, it seems that King Arthur was more so fictional. But if he were to have existed, he would have waged his campaign against the Anglo-Saxons around the fifth and sixth centuries, and and our best known depiction or telling of his tales is from Sir Thomas Malory's book in 1485 called The Death of Arthur. Better, it has another name, but that's just in the English sense. And it just tells the story basically of King Arthur, who was also known as Arthur of Pendragon, and his various campaigns and his rule of Britain at the time. So this is, for some people, their first introduction when they hear those idealized stories of the Knights of the Round Table. And the Knights of the Round Table served as an inspiration for two other figures that I'll mention in the same slide. We next talk about the Song of Roland, which is essentially a poem. It was dated either around 1040 AD to the 1100, and it describes the battles fought by Emperor Charlemagne, whom I described before. Particularly in this case, the protagonist is his nephew Roland, who was betrayed by Ganelon during the Pyrenees Mountains, and essentially Roland is given a choice, so to speak, while he is fighting off his enemy. So he either had the choice to call for reinforcements to help aid him, or he would fight his army alone. And essentially, he chose to fight them off alone because calling in reinforcements would ultimately subject his fellow allies to danger and even death. And at that point, Roland did not see it worthy, so he instead nobly sacrificed himself. And in the Song of Roland, there were 17 points, 17 rules, you could say, that he deemed were relevant to chivalry. So they are as follows: to fear God and maintain his church, to serve the liege lord in valor and faith, to protect the weak and defenseless, to give succor to widows and orphans, to refrain from the wanton giving of offense, to live by honor and for glory, to despise pecuniary reward, to fight for the welfare of all, to obey those placed in authority, to guard the honor of fellow knights, to eschew unfairness, meanness, and deceit, to keep faith, to speak the truth at all times, to persevere to the end in any enterprise begun, to respect the honor of women, never to refuse a challenge from an equal, and never to turn the back upon a foe. Now, some of those do indeed sound familiar to us, as we've heard different iterations of them throughout our respective journeys through the lodge and, if applicable, to the appendant bodies. Next, we have the Code of Chivalry, although I will speak about King Edward III first, since chronologically that precedes him. So King Edward III ruled from 1327 to 1377, and he was actually born in 1312. So he ascended the throne at 14 years of age due to a death in the family. And there's actually an interesting history and speculation regarding a curse with any of the English monarchs with the name of Edward, but that's a story for another time. King Edward III was best known for his military success, and he had a fascination with the legend of King Arthur, so much so that he established the most noble order of the Garter in 1348. And as the shape of the order, the circular shape, was said to have been inspired by the concept of the round table. And King Edward III was successful in creating a better relationship between the nobility and himself that his predecessors failed to do. And it's why it was rare, but he actually ruled for 50 long years. Now, the Order of the Garter, which again sounds familiar, was initially drawn up to include the King, the Prince of Wales, and 12 other knight companions. And then appointments were limited solely to the aristocracy and nobility. But it exists today, and today are chosen from people from various backgrounds in regards to their public service. And you would say the original home of the order is St. George's Chapel in Windsor, which is why Edward III was also known as Edward of Windsor. And in today's world, the order includes members such as Queen Elizabeth II, who is the sovereign of the Garter, and several other prominent members of the royal family, and many other knights. And they have their various ceremonies and their own regalia that they still wear and participate in. Now we go on to the Duke of Burgundy, so better known as Philip the Good or Philip the Third. And he ruled from 1419 to 1467. He also was inspired by the legend of the Knights of the Round Table enough to establish the Order of the Golden Fleece, which also draws inspiration from the tales of Jason and the Argonauts. And in doing so, he established, or he defined, the 12 chivalric virtues of a knight, which were faith, charity, justice, sagacity or wisdom, prudence, temperance, resolution, truth, liberality, diligence, hope, and valor. So we see, again, some of these are mirrored, or some of these sound awfully familiar to us as Masons. Now, going on, let's say 400 years later, a certain Frenchman by the name of Leon Gaultier actually put out 10 Commandments of Chivalry, which he put out in his book in 1891. I'm going to say it again, La Chevalerie. And they are as follows: Thou shalt believe all that the church teaches, and thou shalt observe all its directions. Thou shalt defend the church. Thou shalt respect all weaknesses, and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them. Thou shalt love the country in which thou wast born. Thou shalt not recoil before thine enemy. Thou shalt make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. Thou shalt perform scrupulously thy feudal duties, if they be not contrary to the laws of God. Thou shalt never lie, and shalt remain faithful to thy pledged word. Thou shalt be generous and give largesse to everyone. Thou shalt be everywhere and always the champion of the right and the good against injustice and evil. So, so in summation, we see that's the beginning of chivalry from the Middle Ages, and it's often what we refer to when we think of chivalry. But who's to say that it didn't carry in other cultures, which is what we're going to talk about today. And you might wonder why I didn't mention the literal Knights Templar. The Grand Commander actually has an education series on them, and I hardly invite any Sir Knight or to go through that education source from their website. All right, so chivalry in other cultures. We're going to talk about Japan with the Bushido or the samurai, in Laconia with the Spartans, and Dakota of the West or the Wild West with the cowboys. So something a bit more close to home. All right, with the Bushido or Japan. So when we break down the term Bushido, Bushi means warrior or samurai, and Do means way. So literally it means way of the samurai or way of the warrior. The samurai themselves can be considered counterparts to the knights, and they were actually founded around the 12th century and were very distinctive. They were allowed to wear their swords for a time. They also had top knots for their hair to be arranged in, as well as they wore their distinctive armor. And they existed and acted as peacekeepers or part of the nobility of Japan until the 1860s, when they were eventually pacified. But make no mistake, the virtues of Bushido, which we're about to cover, are still prevalent in Japanese society today. In fact, they practically govern every Japanese person's conduct, which is why these are so stressed and they're known to be so formal in their etiquette. So when we think about them, there are a total, well, some would say 7, but they are justice, courage, compassion, respect, integrity, honor, loyalty, and self-control. So, justice. Justice to them means to reflect on what is fair and uphold the value of a righteous and upstanding moral character. Courage means, like justice, to know what is right and versus wrong, and not only to be able to perceive that, but also to act if there is something to act against. Compassion is to be able to, through patience, manifest love and sympathy. Also, it requires to be able to view the world through the perspective of another. So to be able to walk a mile in another man's shoes. And this is especially important for anyone in a leadership position. If you think about it, if you only look at the world through your lens, you lose so much insight. You lose so much, I'm going to reuse the term, perspective, first not seeing it from another person's viewpoint and understand where they come from. And next is respect. So respect, you acknowledge the experiences and feelings of others. This is how we are able to work as a team. if you make the other person feel like an equal because they are, then you'll win their cooperation and unity will prevail versus the opposing. Integrity. So you have to be able to maintain your integrity or being able to do the right thing when no one is looking in order to even practice the aforementioned values. So to live honestly and sincerely. Honor. This is a big one for the samurai who, if their honor was besmirched, they even had a way of ritualistic suicide to sort of maintain the honor in a ritual known as seppuku or also harakiri. And so the samurai, to them, honor was above all, and that meant to adhere your behavior to the highest code of conduct. And you must be able to acknowledge all responsibilities that you may have possessed. Loyalty. So, biggest thing here to them meant to stay true to yourself. You cannot abandon that loyalty to yourself or especially to others. When you pledge your service to, say, in the case of the samurai, when you pledge your fealty to a shogun or a daimyo, it was essential that you follow through on that, even in the most arduous circumstances. And the last one is not always a value or a virtue you see in Bushido, but in this case, self control means adhering to every aforementioned virtue, to this entire code in all circumstances, whether you are with others or you're by yourself. So, all these, even though samurai no longer wield swords today, literally, there's still a point where they focus on spiritual discipline as well as their conduct of the world. And in doing so, they try to exemplify all eight of these virtues. Next, we have the Code of the Spartan. So, for those who have seen the movie 300 by Zack Snyder or other pieces of media, we know they're familiar with their distinctive shields, their capes, their helms, and their overall battle techniques to include the phalanx. So, most of what we know of the Spartans is actually based from Plutarch. And we do know that the Spartan Empire existed from around 776 BC to 338 BC, with one of the most famous battles, the Battle of Thermopylae by King Leonidas, being during that time. And so for Spartans, they were very practical people. So they judged people on their character and they focused more so on actions as well as maintain your character, honor, and virtue rather than trying to be an intellectual or look through the lens of a philosopher. So wisdom should be through your actions rather than your words. In fact, in their youth, the Spartan boys had to go through a arduous ritual known as a agoge, or I may be mispronouncing that, but it was essentially to go through a harsh regimen of athletics, hunting, and into the basics of literacy. So at the age of 12, they were stripped of their garments, turned into the wild, and forced to survive on their own. Also, the Spartans were well known for literally discarding any male children born with a defect. Spartans, also had the famous phrase, come back with your shield or on it. So it was important that in the face of danger, they always displayed their characteristic bravery and discipline. If you think about it, when they formed up to form a shield, with their shield of phalanx, it was a very tightly knit formation. But if there was so much as one soldier who may have lost his courage and turned back, you'd have a weakness in that shield, and ultimately he would compromise the entire formation. So Spartans were well known to have judged others on their character as well as their own. In fact, this is mentioned out by many of the kings, and especially one known as Agasicles. So it is said that he once turned away a very renowned teacher, saying that he wanted to be a pupil of those whose son he should like to be as well. And the Spartans placed much more value on finding role models to exemplify rather than attending lectures, as they believed this would be the best way to educate yourself and strengthen your own character. And again, they were feared for their military courage. They were unafraid of death. So, courage, particularly in the face of death, was the foundation of Spartan culture. Additionally, discipline or self mastery was also a pivotal or vital part of the Spartans. So, one of the Spartan kings, when asked what sort of education was most popular in Sparta, replied, knowledge of how to rule and how to be ruled. And so, like I said before, they were men of few words, so much so that they were known to be laconic, named after the city of Laconia, in which Sparta was located. So, rather in contrast with the Greeks, who we know could be a little long winded, the Spartans were very cut to the chase sort of people. So they saw more value in if you were deemed an expert in someone, they thought that an expert who knows how to speak should also know when to be silent. There wasn't any room to really beat around the bush, so to speak. Next, we go into the Wild West. And again, this is a picture from The Good, the Bad, and Ugly. And we know the Wild West was a time of outlaws, of exploration, of cowboys, of a lot of idealized tales. And as far as the actual era, so you could say that it began around the 1700s, although the period we know best exists between after the Civil War up until 1890 with the closing of the frontier by the Census Bureau. And essentially, the Wild West was an expansion of the United States to uphold the concept of manifest destiny or from sea to shining sea. And as you may have noticed or you may have heard, there was no real written code of conduct for the cowboys or those pioneers in the West. They more so had a code of ethics that was just basically common sense as well as somewhat derived from the Bible. It was actually first chronicled by the famous Western writer Zan Grey in his novel The Code of the West in 1934. And this code was later iterated on by Ramon Adams, a Western historian, in his 1969 book, The Cowman and His Code of Ethics. Essentially, there were several values at the time that were mostly meant on a gentleman's agreement in regards for etiquette for survival, although never written really into statutes or hard writing, were respected everywhere on the frontier. This was this was later transformed to 10 ethics derived in a book known as Cowboy Ethics by James P. Owen. So they are as follows: live each day with courage, take pride in your work, always finish what you start, do what has to be done, be fair but tough, when you make a promise, keep it, ride for the brand, talk less, say more, remember that some things are not for sale, and know where to draw the line. These are so taken to heart that the state of Wyoming actually, on July 1st, 2010, adopted these 10 points in the cowboy ethics as their official state code. Now, when we look at what these mean, I want to call your attention to the last few points. So, ride for the brand. What that essentially means is you know what you're bound to, you know what you're trying to accomplish, stay true to that. So that sort of focuses again on the concept of loyalty as echoed by the Bushido virtues. Talk less, say more, something the Spartans held dear as well. And then remember that some things are not for sale, like one's integrity or one's loyalty, and then know where to draw the line. So there's always a fine line between just doing your own thing, remaining passive, versus actually having to take action. All of these we see some similarities. So it's essential to note that throughout human civilization, there is an importance in having a system of ethics, of morality, and honor. that civilization without it may more or less descend in anarchy. And these are actually exemplified in a concept known as the warrior ethos. So this is a concept defined by the United States Air Force Academy as the embodiment of the warrior spirit, whereas ethos is a derivative of the Greek word for ethics. So essentially, this is a code of conduct for the warrior that guides his values and actions. And like we've covered before, it is often an oral code passed down from generation to generation rather than something etched into paper or stone. It is the important philosophy that one must balance the need for taking action versus voluntary self restraint. And this is the core of warrior ethos. Now, when we look at today's time as Knights Templar, we are dub ourselves as chivalric masonry. So it's important that we exemplify all these virtues that have been carried on by those before us, even though we're not necessarily a derivative from them. And it's also important to note that last point of warrior ethos, that fine balance between taking action versus self-restraint. You may have seen for those currently the Knights Templar that we have some aspects of military in us, such as uniforms, drill, and ceremony. But in fact, those are just more so for custom and ritual purposes. We are not actually supposed to engage in literal warfare or things like that as an organization. We often may take the whole crusades or the holy warriors as too literal. And it's important to note that in this time, just like the samurai were pacified, and yet they carried their tenets with them into today's world as a code of conduct, that we do the same. These are not necessarily us having to wage literal war against our enemies or those who may act against us, but more so as if we were to have to pursue the code of the warrior. It is more of a spiritual warfare against the vices and the deceits of the world. Moreover, we need to know that as chivalric Masons, or Masons in general, we need to not purposely seek out causing any disturbance or need for aggression. So whether that be something like um, just stirring up an affair in the brotherhood or something akin to that, that sort of is the antithesis of chivalry. And now we will look in summation. Actually, we are literally the modern Order of the Temple, as you may hear going through the ceremonies of the Knights Templar, or even just from mentioning. So we are obviously not the Order of Temple of the Knights Templar that were executed, like of the days of Jacques de Molay. We're our own Order of the Temple now that focuses on a more spiritual faith rather than literal Templary. And like I said before, Knights Templar, the chivalric Masons, provides lessons that build on what is learned, that build on what is communicated in the Blue Lodge. And it melds them together with lessons of Christian brotherhood and a devotion to the duties that were possessed by the ancient Templars. So that spirit still does live on, even though the ancient Templars of old no longer exist in today's world. So it is through the spirit of chivalry that we need to be able to promote the good of the order and the world. So the modern Knight Templar, I believe, is devoted to act with honor in all things and to abstain against deceit and cowardice. So lessons that we also hear in the Blue Lodge through our journeys through the symbolic degrees. And as Knights Templar, it is our responsibility to represent those chivalric values in our everyday lives and professional activities, to act by example and provide an inspiration to those who either are not fellow Sir Knights or brethren, or those who are prospective members. Think about this. Take away your uniform, take away your regalia. It's easy to be a Knight Templar or a Mason within the walls of an asylum, a commandery, or within a lodge. But when we take away all our outward accoutrements and we walk into our daily life, are people able to know that, hey, based on his conduct alone, we know him to be a Mason, we know him to be a truly chivalrous person. We know him to be a Knight Templar or a Mason. If the answer to that is anything but a resounding and quick yes, some introspection is needed, because otherwise we focus too much on the platitudes, on these temporary honors, so to speak, rather than taking to heart the lessons taught by these distinguished degrees and orders and fully acting upon them. Actually, I read an article, I believe, in the January 2022 edition of the Knights Templar magazine, in which I believe the managing editor talked about establishing a Templar school or a Knight school, no pun intended, for those who should aspire and to learn what it truly means to be a knight. So, whether that curriculum should involve a history of the Templars of old, a history and structure of the Grand Encampment, and what it truly means to be a Knight Templar, that would be an ideal system. And hopefully, this educational presentation is sort of a start of that. It gives room for contemplation and hopes to drive the lessons and the topics of our predecessors, of those we succeed to take the mantle from by calling ourselves chivalric Masons, and gives opportunities to apply them to our everyday life in order to be the best Knight Templar and the best Mason we can be. Because otherwise, if we search for only the superficial aspects of our craft, we're doing a huge disservice to our order, to our fellow, whether it be brethren, companions, sir knights, in general, just our fellow men. So I challenge each and every brother, companion, or sir knight watching this to just take a moment and reflect on everything that I've discussed today. See what you can take from it and how you can adapt it to your own life. Because although it's often said that, alas, chivalry is dead, I beg to differ. It's just that chivalry exists in a different form today as a code of conduct or etiquette in terms of gentlemanly behavior, rather than the chivalry of the knights and horseback soldiers, samurai of old. And with that, that concludes my talks. So thank you all for your attention. And for those interested, these are my works cited.